I didn't raise my voice, not once. My son-in-law stood in the middle of my living room, the living room I'd built with my own hands 31 years ago, and told me I was a burden. He used that exact word, burden. And my daughter stood behind him, arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. I just looked at him. I nodded slowly, and then I went to find my suitcase. I want to tell you what led to that moment, because it didn't start that day. It never starts on the day you finally leave. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 38 years working as a civil engineer for the county. I built bridges, not metaphorically, actual bridges. Overpasses, drainage systems, retaining walls that kept hillsides from swallowing suburban neighborhoods during heavy rain. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I want you to understand the kind of man I am. I believe in structure. I believe that things are built to last, or they aren't worth building at all. My wife, Linda, passed 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 14 months between the diagnosis and the end, and I'd give anything to have those months back, even knowing how they ended. We had one daughter. Her name is Joelle. She was 26 when her mother died. Already out of college, already working in marketing at a firm downtown. She handled the grief the way a lot of young people do, by staying busy, by keeping distance from anything that reminded her of what she'd lost. That included me for a while. I didn't take it personally. Linda was the emotional center of our family. Without her, Joelle and I didn't quite know how to talk to each other. We'd go weeks without a call. When we did talk, it was practical. Did you get the documents from the attorney? Can you make it to Christmas? How are you feeling? Fine. Good. I'm fine. Then Joel met my son-in-law. His name is Trent. He came from money. Old money. The kind that makes a man soft in a way he doesn't even recognize in himself. His family had a house in the Carolinas and another in Colorado. He'd never worked a job that wasn't handed to him. He was handsome. I'll give him that. And he had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been seriously told no. Joel brought him home for Thanksgiving 3 years after Linda died. And I tried. I genuinely tried. He shook my hand and immediately started telling me about an investment opportunity he was involved in, before we'd even sat down for dinner. I remember thinking, this man has never once in his life been interested in what someone else had to say. But Joel smiled at him the way she used to smile as a little girl, and I thought, she's happy. That's enough. That has to be enough. They got married in the spring. A big wedding, more guests than I knew what to do with, held at a venue that cost more per hour than I used to make in a week. I paid for a third of it. I didn't mention that then, and I never mentioned it after. That's not the kind of man I am. They moved into a house about 40 minutes from me. Trent had gotten it in his name. A wedding gift from his father, technically. Though, from what I understood, the gift came with a great deal of conditions and expectations attached. That family didn't give things freely. Nothing was ever truly free with them. The first 2 years were fine. We have Sunday dinners a couple times a month. I'd drive out, bring something, a pie, a good bottle of wine, whatever felt right. Joelle would hug me at the door. Trent would be in a living room watching something on television, and he'd give me a wave without getting up. I'd sit at the table he'd never offered to help set and eat food Joelle had cooked, while Trent described the deal he was working on, or the trip they were planning, or some slight he'd experienced at the hands of someone who hadn't given him adequate respect. I listened. I ate. I drove home. Then Linda's mother died and left me the property. This is the part of the story I want to be careful about, because it matters. My mother-in-law, Edna, was a remarkable woman. She'd outlived my wife by 9 years, which I know she found unbearable. She lived alone in a house in the hill country outside of Austin, a modest house on 11 acres with a workshop and a barn and a creek that ran along the back edge of the property. She'd never once mentioned what she planned to do with it when she was gone. I assumed there were cousins, old friends, a church perhaps. I didn't ask, and I didn't think about it. When the attorney called me the week after her funeral, I thought it was about clearing out the house. Instead, he told me she'd left the property to me outright. The house, the land, everything on it. Her reasoning, which she put in a letter that the attorney read to me over the phone, was simple. She trusted me to honor what the land had meant to Linda. She'd watched me care for her daughter through 14 months of illness, and she'd never forgotten it. I sat in my truck for a long time after that call. I drove out to see the property that weekend. It had been 3 years since I'd visited Edna there. The house needed work. The kitchen was outdated. There were roof shingles that had seen better days. One of the barn doors had come off its upper hinge. But the land was beautiful. 11 acres of cedar and live oak. The creek still running clear. The sky at night wider than anything you find in the city. I decided I was going to fix the house and move there. I told Joelle on a Sunday. I drove out, sat down at that table, and told her calmly what had happened and what I intended to do. I watched her face while I talked. Something shifted in it. Some calculation I wasn't quite fast enough to read. Trent asked immediately how much the property was worth. I said I didn't know exactly. I hadn't had it appraised. He said that seemed like the first thing I should do. Joel said she thought it was wonderful that Grandma Edna had thought of me. I drove home thinking, this will be fine. This is good news. People don't turn good news into problems. I was wrong about that. The call started 2 weeks later. Not from Joel, from Trent. He'd call in the evenings when I was usually having dinner or sitting on the back porch with a book. He had ideas about the property. He knew a developer who was looking for land in that county. He had a friend in commercial real estate. He said the words highest and best use in a way that suggested he'd just learned them. He talked about the market, about timing, about opportunity. He never once asked what I wanted. I told him, politely, each time that I wasn't interested in selling. He started pushing harder. I don't know if he thought persistence would eventually wear me down, or if he simply couldn't process that someone would refuse an obvious financial opportunity. He began involving Joelle. She'd call after Trent's calls and gently echo whatever he'd said, though in softer language. I realized, slowly, that they'd been talking about this together, that they'd decided what should happen with my property, and were working in tandem to make it happen. I told Joelle directly, the land isn't for sale. It was Linda's mother's land. I'm going to fix up that house, and I'm going to live there. That's the end of it. She went quiet on the phone. Then she said very carefully, Dad, we've been thinking, and we think it would make more sense for you to sell it and come live with us. I asked her what she meant. She explained. They had a spare bedroom. I was getting older. It would be practical. I could help around the house, be available for when they eventually had children, be close in case anything happened to my health. I want you to understand what she was describing. She was describing a situation in which I would sell 11 acres of land that had belonged to Linda's mother, give up my own home, move into a spare bedroom in my son-in-law's house, and be available, meaning I would function as free labor and a backup plan. In exchange, I would have proximity to my daughter. I said no. Politely, clearly, firmly, no. 2 months passed. Things were cool between us. I drove out to the property on weekends and started working. I hired a roofer for the shingles, fixed the barn door myself, started gutting the outdated kitchen. I drove back into the city during the week for work. I was consulting part-time by then, a couple of county projects. The routine felt good. I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was building something again. Then Joelle called and asked if I could come to dinner. Just dinner, she said. She missed me. She wanted to talk. I went. Trent was at the table when I arrived. So was his father, a man named Whitfield. I'd met him perhaps 4 times at that point, never warmly. He was wearing a jacket at the dinner table like he was attending a board meeting. Joel had made pot roast, Linda's recipe, the one I'd taught her. The smell of it hit me when I walked in, and for a second I just stood there in the entryway holding a bottle of wine and missing my wife so much I couldn't breathe. Then I sat down and they began. It wasn't a dinner. It was an intervention. Whitfield did most of the talking at first. He was practiced at this kind of thing, at framing a takeover as generosity. He said the family had been discussing my situation. He said they were concerned. He said the property was a significant asset that I didn't have the resources to properly develop, and that holding onto it out of sentiment was, and I remember this word exactly, impractical. I looked at Joelle. She was looking at her plate. I put my fork down. I told them I appreciated the concern. I told them the property was not available for discussion. I told them that Edna had left it to me for reasons that had nothing to do with development or asset management, and that I intended to honor her wishes by living there. Trent looked at his father. His father made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but close. Trent leaned forward. He said, "You're 64 years old. You're going to move to 11 acres in the middle of nowhere by yourself. And do what, exactly? Fix fences until you have a heart attack?" I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "That's my business." He said, "We're trying to make it easier for you." I said, "I didn't ask you to." The dinner ended shortly after that. Not with shouting. I want to be clear about that. There was no scene. I finished the pot roast, which was good, said goodnight to everyone, thanked Joel for cooking, and drove home. In the car I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something quieter than anger. A kind of grief, maybe, for the version of this relationship I'd believed in. I started transferring the property officially into a trust the following week. I'd spoken to an attorney friend, an old colleague whose wife had passed around the same time as Linda, who I'd stayed close to over the years. His name is Aldred. Sharp man, careful man, the kind of lawyer who asks 3 questions before he answers 1. He'd been telling me for years to get my affairs in order, and after that dinner, I finally listened. I also, quietly, put my city house on the market. I didn't tell Joelle. Months went by. The city house sold faster than I expected. I moved my things to the hill country property over 3 weekends, with help from 2 old friends from the county, men I'd worked alongside for years, who brought a truck and a case of beer and didn't ask a lot of questions. The house was in good enough shape by then. New roof, working kitchen, the barn secured. It wasn't fancy. It was solid. I called Joelle from the porch the night I officially moved in. The sun was going down behind the cedars and the creek was audible from where I sat. I told her I'd moved. She was quiet for a moment, then asked for the address. I gave it to her. She said, "You actually did it." I said, "I told you I was going to." She said, "Trent's not happy." I said, "Joel, I love you, but Trent's feelings about my property aren't something I'm able to help with." Another silence. Then she said goodnight. I thought, sitting there in the dark with the creek running and the stars doing what stars do out in the hill country, that maybe this was the end of it, that they'd accepted it, that we'd find a new normal. Trent called me the next morning at 7:15. He was angry in the way that entitled men get angry, not hot but cold and precise, like he was building a legal case. He said I had made a significant financial decision without consulting the family. I said it was my property and my decision. He said that my choices affected Joelle. I said I understood that, but that adults are allowed to make choices about their own lives. He said I was being selfish. I said that was an interesting word coming from him, and I left it at that. He hung up. The call slowed after that. I got used to the silence. I finished fixing the workshop, started spending evenings out there the way I'd spent evenings in my garage my whole life, just working with my hands, fixing things that needed fixing, building things that didn't exist yet. I put a bench in by the creek. I planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. I learned the rhythms of 11 acres, where the deer came through in the early morning, where the ground was wet after rain, which part of the roof caught the afternoon heat. I felt like myself again. After years of not quite feeling like myself, I felt like myself again. It was 4 months after I moved in that Joelle called and asked if she could come stay for a few days. Just her, she said. She needed a break. I said, of course. She arrived on a Friday evening, looking tired in a way I recognized. Not physically tired, but wrung out. We sat on the porch and I made coffee, and she didn't say much for a while. We watched the dark come in from the east. The creek made its sound. A whip-poor will started up somewhere in the cedars. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't rush her. I've learned that rushing people through apologies doesn't help anyone." She said she'd let Trent drive the conversation about my property, about my life, about what I should do with what was mine. She said she'd told herself she was just trying to look out for me, but she knew that wasn't really the truth. She said Trent had convinced her that managing my situation was somehow their responsibility, and she hadn't pushed back the way she should have. I asked her what she meant by managing my situation. She looked at me sideways. She said, "He thought if you sold the property and moved in with us, there'd be something in it for us eventually. The money from the sale. Maybe the city house, too." I nodded. I wasn't surprised. I was grateful she'd said it out loud. I said, "I know." She said, "You knew?" I said, "Joelle, I've been watching people negotiate since before you were born. I knew." She laughed a little. It was Linda's laugh, quick and surprised. It hit me in the chest the way it always does. I told her what I'd done. The trust, the city house sale, all of it. She listened. When I was finished, she asked why I hadn't told her. I said, "Because I needed to see what you'd do when you thought the conversation wasn't over." She was quiet for a long time after that. She stayed for 5 days. She helped me plant the second half of the kitchen garden. She slept 10 hours a night in the back bedroom that still smelled like cedar from the closet. On the last morning, over coffee, she told me she'd been having doubts about her marriage for longer than she'd admitted to herself. I didn't tell her what to do. I just listened, which is what she needed. When she left, she hugged me in the driveway for a long time. Before she got in the car, she said, "The property's beautiful, Dad. Grandma Edna would have loved that you're here." I said, "I think she knew." 3 weeks after Joel's visit, I got a call from Aldred. There had been a formal inquiry through an attorney Trent's father had hired about the structure of the trust and whether it could be contested. Aldred had dealt with it in 2 phone calls. There was nothing to contest. Everything had been done correctly, documented carefully, filed properly. The inquiry went nowhere. I never heard from Trent's father again. I did hear from Trent once more. A brief call about a month later. He said he thought I'd made a mistake. I said I appreciated him sharing that. He said he hoped I realized what I was doing to my daughter's marriage. I said very carefully, "I haven't done anything to your marriage. If there are problems there, those problems existed before I moved to the hill country." He hung up again. That was 8 months ago. The property is in good shape now. The workshop runs, the garden produces more squash than any one man can eat, and the bench by the creek has become my favorite place on earth. I take my coffee out there in the mornings and watch the light come through the live oaks, and I think about Linda and about Edna and about the strange path that led me here. Joelle comes to visit every few weeks. She comes alone, and she stays as long as she needs to. I don't ask about Trent. She tells me what she's comfortable telling me. I cook, or we drive into the nearest small town for breakfast, or we just sit on the porch and don't say much. It's the best version of our relationship we've had since before her mother died. Maybe the best version we've ever had. Last month she left a card on the kitchen table before she drove back. A simple card, not a birthday card or a holiday card, just a blank note card she'd written on. It said, "I'm sorry I forgot who you were. I remember now. I've kept it in the drawer of my workbench, next to an old photo of Linda in this very yard, the one time she came to visit her mother out here, standing barefoot in the grass with her hair in the wind and her eyes half closed against the sun. I'm not a man who needs the last word. I'm not a man who needs to be vindicated or celebrated or proved right. I just needed to live the life I built, on the land that was given to me in good faith, in the house that needed fixing and got fixed. Some things are built to last. Some aren't. That's not tragedy. That's just how things are.